Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to look at making salts, but for this particular video we are looking at making insoluble salts as opposed to the soluble salts that we looked at previously. Now the first example I've got here is a solution called lead nitrate, so that is a solution, it's a liquid, and we can react it with another solution called potassium iodide, which is this solution here, and as soon as the two solutions meet, what happens is we get a solid substance which is formed in the solution, and we call that solid substance a precipitate. And what's happened is a precipitation reaction, and that's when a solid substance is formed as a result of two solutions reacting together. And it's important to remember that for this particular example of making insoluble salts, it's the ions that are reacting, ions in the two solutions. So for the lead we have lead ions, and those are Pb2+, and from the potassium iodide it's the iodide ions that are reacting, so that's I minus. So those two will react and produce a substance called lead iodide, and that's our precipitate there, that's our solid substance there. Another example we could look at is producing or reacting barium chloride and sodium sulfate, and in that reaction we would get a precipitate again, a solid substance formed, and the two ions that are reacting would be the barium ions from the barium chloride and the sulfate ions from the sodium sulfate, and you'd end up with barium sulfate as your precipitate. Okay, so that's a couple of examples of how you can make insoluble salts. You need to know the process of how you can actually produce these in the lab if you needed to, and you need to be able to talk about the steps involved. And it's much simpler than our previous example of making soluble salts. In this case we would just react our two solutions and we would get our precipitate formed, and remember that precipitate is insoluble, so it doesn't dissolve in water, and it's solid. So all you need to do for the next step, once you've got that solution, is to filter it, and because it's solid and because it's insoluble it will stay in the filter paper there, and the next stage is really just a question of drying it out. You might wash it with a bit of distilled water, just to wash it, and then you would dry it out, and then you would have your solid precipitate there. So this procedure is much simpler than making these soluble salts, and you must be able to actually just describe this procedure step by step, or recognize it if you saw it written down. The last thing I want to go through really is the uses of precipitation reactions. They are used for various things, and one of those is for treating effluent. Now effluent is waste that is produced by certain factories, and in that effluent you might find certain ions, lead ions, manganese ions and chromium ions among others, and these are toxic or poisonous and would be dangerous if they got out into the environment. What we can do, however, is before we release that effluent from this factory here, for example, we could treat it to remove these ions, and we can use a precipitation reaction. So what you would do, carry out a reaction that looks a bit like this. So we've got our chromium ions, which I've chosen here. You can react it with hydroxide ions from another solution, and you would end up with chromium hydroxide. And to give that in just a little bit more detail, just to show what's going on, we've got our chromium ions, and we know this is ions because we've got our 3+ up here. We've got hydroxide ions, which is